Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Encanto Gesha wash processed Colombia from Scenery Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Scenery, based out of London, England, and this is their first ever appearance on this channel. As they're a coffee roaster I had zero familiarity with going into this review, and we actually picked this coffee up from Airworks October Coffee Drop, as we did have some pretty extensive conversations about this coffee roaster with Airworks, and what they sold us on was the fact that Scenery was heavily influenced by Calendar, which is of course one of our favorite Irish coffee roasters. So I figured we'd go ahead and check them out, and we'll see how this coffee turned out, as this right here is day 46. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe, a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind roast profile for this coffee. So it is kind of interesting. Once again, I mentioned that they are heavily influenced by Calendar, or at least so I was told. And I feel like, interestingly, the best way to kind of describe their roast profile is if Calendar was an English-based coffee roaster. Because once again, it's kind of interesting how English coffee roasters all have this somewhat similar taste to them. I can say that this one does feel notably lighter than a lot of other English-based coffee roasters that we've reviewed. But even then, it still has that kind of interesting English style of development to it, which is to say that it's not necessarily the lightest coffee out there. I feel like some people might say light medium, somewhere in that range, but I don't necessarily have a better descriptor other than saying it just feels like a light English coffee. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 19, first impression, and we did opt for the V60 as the coffee does have a notable florality immediately off brew with the listed jasmine. Additionally, there's plenty of fresh fruit aspects to it as well, reminiscent of orange fruits and some slight stone fruits as well. It cools off into a slightly more robust sense, but otherwise it was a very nice start for this coffee. And this is where things do get kind of interesting on this one, as on day 22 we opted for the Chemex, and the coffee is a bit more reminiscent this time around of an English coffee. So the first time that we did brew it, I said to myself, okay, this is very nice. It tastes like a Gesha. It's very clean. It's just got a lot of delicacy to it. And then this time around, I said, okay, it feels now much more like an English coffee, which at times I would never necessarily describe as being super delicate. If anything else, I would say that it just felt like it had that slight developed quality to it with a otherwise clean and floral base. Jasmine does continue to remain abundant with a sweet citric aspect as well, so this one was still good. But we move on to day 25 as we opted for the April brewer, and there were further struggles to replicate that very positive first impression with more of the British-like robustness to contract an otherwise fruit and floral forward experience. Notably less definition relative to some of the earlier days, as at this point it's become mostly citric dominant, and citric dominant in a slightly undefined sense. Day 28 through the V60, and we decided to lower the extraction adjustments on this one. So it's interesting that on the back of their bag they do actually have a slight recipe which kind of gives you two options. So it either gives you a higher extraction one, which is at 98 Celsius, and then was it 65 grams per liter, or the other way around, 94 Celsius with 55 grams per liter. So it basically is in between our standard recipe, so we decided to go with the lower extraction ones. And the coffee hasn't necessarily improved, as it's still offering a slight Gesha-like feel at the initial onset of brewing this coffee, but it trails off rather quickly into a somewhat muddled citric tone. It has a hidden florality that's presented underneath a slightly more developed feel in terms of that robustness that we keep referencing. So we move on to day 31 as we opted for the Chemex with lower extraction adjustments, and there's still struggles with this coffee as it does continue to remain muddled with a slight hint of Gesha-like qualities in the background. There's a continued lack of definition as the coffee does continue to feel like it has a generic citric aspect with some undefined florality this time around, and there's a slightly interesting, we'll call it vegetal quality that we'll discuss a little bit more from this point going forward. Day 34. Back to the V60 with our standard recipe, and the coffee is skewing a little bit more in a honeyed-like sense with the florality. In addition to that, there's an abundant bit of, we'll describe as a tropical fruit aspect, still mostly citric with a slight bit of berry fruits this time around, but overall a little bit undefined in general. We move on to day 37 as we opted for the Chemex with our standard recipe, and the coffee still feels like it's skewing a little bit more on that vegetal side of things, which is something that we mentioned. And on this day, it was the most prominent and noticeable that it had been up to this point. So I did chalk this one up to possible brewing error altogether because of that very strong vegetal quality. So we just kind of threw this day away and opted to try one more time on day 40 with the V60. And there were more issues this time around as well, as it still had that same vegetal-like feel to it that I would describe as being reminiscent of green peas. And that's what this coffee for the most part reminded me of. As I really thought about it, I said a lot of those days where I was feeling that kind of interesting vegetal quality, it really just kind of tastes a little bit like green peas. Outside of that, there's a faint fruit and floral quality with a lack of definition, herbality and florals, zest to the citrus, and an interesting strong tea-like feel to it as well. So a lot of notes that are kind of, I want to say, scattered all over the board, as it's rare that I get this word, we'll say scattered, with the descriptions that I do have of a coffee. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have a lot of level 4s, so let's go through those, and we will start with we'll actually start with the finish, level 4. So the finish in itself is kind of interesting given that it has that slightly robust quality to it, especially given that it is a Gesha coffee. And I do have to say, I couldn't necessarily tell the Gesha-like characteristics of this one, mostly because it didn't have that subtlety, that delicacy, that really nice, pretty finish to it. It just did come off a little bit more like some other varietal in general. I don't necessarily have an ideal description for that, but once again, this coffee did leave me a little flustered when trying to describe it at times. Sweetness, level 4. I'm going to say this a lot when discussing this tasting wheel. Sweetness, it was a little bit of an undefined sweetness to it. Yeah, the citric qualities did come out a little bit sweeter, but given that it wasn't overly well defined and a little bit more muddled, it's just basically to say that there was a citric sweetness to this one. Acidity, level 4. Yeah, this one was also very bright, and I think that kind of goes counterintuitive to the rest of the experience with this coffee, given that there was that robustness and that slightly strange vegetal quality to it. So it still did score pretty high in that regard, and even then, I don't necessarily have an ideal descriptor for that one. Florality, level 4. I'd have to say there were times where there was a little bit more of a honey-like floral component that was present within this one, but outside of that, once again, the florality came in a little bit more of a generic floral sense to it, as it was really difficult to kind of get some really nice definition in that aspect too. Citrus fruit, level 4. I do recall one of the notes they have listed on here is a clementine, and I would say that first time that we did brew this coffee, I could certainly see it, but from that point going forward, it didn't necessarily have that same level of definition, as it was just this citric quality. You're just feeling citrus and it's sweet, and that's just kind of the best description I have, because I don't necessarily think I could closely align it with any sort of citric fruit I've had in the past. Savoriness, level 4. We'll kind of discuss that with the cleanliness in general. So savoriness, level 4, and that is that slight vegetal quality to it, but I do have to say it is pretty notable, as it's rare that we score the savoriness that high for a coffee. And one time I can say, okay, possible brewing error. Second time, I'm not entirely sure what happened in that case, but even then, it was prominent earlier, but I just kind of kept disregarding it because I'm like, I'm not entirely sure why I'm experiencing that within this coffee. It's more defined than any of the other qualities that we are experiencing from this coffee, so that in itself was pretty interesting, and that it scored that level 4 mark. Cleanliness, level 4. So that's probably the biggest anomaly within this entire tasting wheel, because yeah, this is a Gesha, so I guess on paper you'd expect this one to be on the cleaner side of things, a washed Gesha nonetheless. But even then, I continue to harp on the fact that a lot of this coffee didn't have great definition to it, especially for it being a Gesha coffee. I think I can probably safely say that this is the Gesha coffee we've reviewed that it's been just so difficult to identify and describe the flavor profile within the majority of this coffee, especially after brew. The first sip, you get some Gesha-like qualities, but from that point going forward, it's just tricky to pick up the rest of those. And outside of that, though, it's still clean, I suppose, because there's nothing that can really hinder it from that overall level 4. But even then, I feel like it was a little bit of a stretch to get it there to that level 4 mark, given that there were so many of these things kind of hindering this overall experience. A couple of level 3s, we'll start with the berry fruit, and I guess we can probably go right to the stone fruit tone in that sense too, both at that level 3. I don't have great descriptors for those, honestly. The stone fruit quality, I would say maybe a little bit more reminiscent of some of the lighter colored stone fruit, so I could probably see a little bit more of a mango-like quality to it. And then what else do we have? The body at level 3. That in itself is also very surprising given that this is a Gesha coffee. I suppose that since it's a Colombian Gesha, it might have a little bit more body to it. But yeah, that's the tasting wheel. As I'm looking at it, I feel like that's kind of a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I will say this, we are reviewing one more coffee from Scenery, and I did enjoy that coffee significantly more than I enjoyed this one. And I've also heard some feedback from, we'll just say, a couple of other people, and they've also had some strange experiences with this coffee. So I was very glad to find out that I'm not on my own when it comes to this coffee, because the second time I brewed this coffee, I said, I'm not sure where that first experience went and why it's been so difficult for me to not just pick up components within this coffee or flavor descriptions, profiles within this coffee, but why the coffee is kind of trailing off the way that it is. So it did give me a little bit more reassurance that it's not just me, though I will still chalk it up to possible brewing error or possible skill issue right here, because I don't know what happened, and I'm not entirely sure what happened, like why I couldn't get this coffee right, because I don't think I've been this stumped on a coffee in terms of figuring it out in a very long time. I really had no idea how to adjust it or how to fix it, but this was just kind of the overall experience that I had from this one specifically. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, I will say, if you do like the English style of coffee, it tastes like an English coffee. I still feel like if you would have put this on a table with a bunch of other English, non-English coffee roasters, I would have been able to pick this one out as the English-based coffee roaster because it did have that sort of feel to it. So that's the first place I'll start. Lighter relative to those, and then in addition to that, a little bit more of a citric forward profile to it with still some nice clarity. I will say that's the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd definitely love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the El Encanto Gesha, wash processed Colombia from Scenery Coffee. Thank you for watching.